Hi everyone, this is Melody, and this is your first discussion unit recap. I like to sort of talk about the main points that came up in the discussions because with so many students and so many great responses, it's sometimes a little bit difficult to keep track of everything. And so Dr. Coria Torres and I like to do a little recap at the beginning of the next unit when we have discussion in the previous unit, just to kind of talk a little bit about what we discussed, basically. So wanted to just lay out the questions that you guys kind of chose the most to talk about in this unit in particular. So we looked at historical perspectives of serving students with blindness. And I think this question had many responses. Why is it important for professionals in the field to understand the historical perspectives of the past? And of course, you know, this isn't just important in our field, but this is important in all areas of study and all kind of facets of life, that we learned from mistakes that we've made, that we learned from challenges that we've had, and we've learned especially from the things that have worked, and we've tried to build on those. And so everybody did a great job of kind of talking about, you know, the steps toward inclusion. So I've just kind of put here some of the basic laws that brought us to IDEA and policy and practice that we now use for students within special education in our schools. And many of you pointed out sort of how inclusion grew, how students became quote unquote mainstreamed into regular and general education, but that it was a slow sort of integration into classrooms. And a few of you also pointed out from your experiences that, you know, you still see a level of segregation, where students need to have sort of one-on-one instruction in the expanded core curriculum. And for those of you who are new to our population of students and teaching them, the expanded core curriculum are all the things above and beyond the regular education curriculum that students with visual impairment and blindness need to succeed. So areas of compensatory skills such as Braille, areas of independent movement and safe movement such as orientation and mobility, technology, which is something that has to be specifically taught for our students. And there are a host of others. Recreation and leisure, for example, is another one. And so you'll kind of get introduced to these as we go along. And I'm not going to spend too much time on them right now, but it's kind of one of the reasons that many of our students do have to have specialized instruction that's kind of outside of general education, is because they simply have more unique needs and they need access to the materials that are available to them in the general education setting. And so it sort of takes extra time, to be quite honest. Especially if they're doing orientation mobility, which means they're getting out in the community, they're getting out in the environment, and that is usually done in one-on-one instruction, because to be quite frank, that's kind of the only way that it can be done to fully understand and use a cane independently for those folks that need it. So inclusion could look different, and I encourage you to think a little bit about your own experiences in school, and also your own experiences in higher education, in secondary education, if that's something that you went through, and also in you know, high school and stuff like that. And what did you notice about the way students with visual impairment or disabilities were included or discluded, so to speak? Because we do notice throughout history that things kind of happen slowly, unfortunately. Some of you also talked a little bit about low incidence disabilities in general education classrooms and your experience with that, and how, you know, what you've seen is that they might not really be general ed teachers might not be sort of completely into or 100% supportive of having low incidence kids with disabilities in their classrooms. And that's been a little bit of my experience too. You know, there's good and bad teachers everywhere. And our role of the teacher of the visually impaired is really to get those teachers comfortable with our students so that they understand what a visual impairment means for education, and so that we can do everything within our power to adapt materials and make things accessible for the student. And we really have to collaborate. And we'll talk to a big part of sort of the historical perspectives of the past is understanding the School for the Blind and the role that that plays. And we'll touch on that too. So we also in our field have to have sort of a history of advocacy for inclusion. So what have we done along the way to really understand that, to understand that there are going to be teachers who are simply not comfortable having students with visual impairment in their classroom, and what can we teach them? And so we are always our students' advocates, and in turn what we need to do is remove ourselves from that equation and teach them to be their own best advocates. So the other question that folks seemed to like was that talking about residential schools for the blind, and I'll just go through this really quickly. So this is actually a really interesting topic to me. I've worked at quite a few schools for the blind. I've worked at the New Mexico School for the Blind for the past 10 years, and I have worked for the Perkins School for the Blind as well, and also visited the campuses of other blind schools and certainly used their resources. So, the first blind school was in 1829 in Massachusetts, and in the 1960s, these, schools for the blind, they were set up in geographic regions. So, for example, in New Mexico, we have a large main campus school, and then we have an early childhood program that's in Albuquerque, and that's where I've worked. And the Perkins School for the Blind is in Watertown, Massachusetts, which is fairly close to Boston. The Colorado School for the Blind, you guys, some of you in Colorado may have visited, is in Colorado Springs, and that's a school for the deaf and blind, and quite typically, schools for the blind can be actually combined with schools for the deaf as well. So sort of kind of having the dual impairments, sensory impairments there. It's kind of weird today to think about going to a school that's just specific for one population. But as you go along in your coursework, I think you'll kind of realize the pros and cons to it. It's a really interesting topic because, on the one hand, schools for the blind really are sort of the places where we have a lot of knowledge and expertise on children with visual impairments. And so I can say from personal experience working at a school for the blind, it's actually a really comfortable environment because everybody there understands the needs of the child, what it is we have to teach them, how we're going to assess them, what are the resources available to us. And that doesn't always happen at public school or a sort of more typical setting. There you actually have to, in my opinion, work a lot harder to help groups of people that you collaborate with, the child's team, and other individuals as well, really understand what visual impairment is. That's kind of my own take on it. We talked a little bit in the discussion about, our blind school is really a form of segregation, and I think we kind of came away with the pros and cons that it's really nice to be able to have specialized instruction that students need and to have access to resources. And also, Schools for the Blind is important because they've really been the ones who have kind of set the curricula, set the level of expertise, set best practices. They house a lot of people who really know their stuff when it comes to educating kids with visual impairment. And they are important, but there are pros and cons. Some of the cons are, yes, it's an extremely segregated environment. And when we talk about what's written in IDEA for our students within their IEPs, their individualized education plans, we need to say that an environment is the least restrictive environment for them. And I'm not sure if we can really say that in a school for the blind, which really is a very restrictive environment. So what Schools for the Blind do nowadays, and you might want to just get on a couple of different websites and check it out, is a lot of them do short-term placement. So children can go there for just very intense orientation and mobility lessons or daily living skills lessons or technology. Our School for the Blind in Washington State as an awesome math program, and kids actually kind of like come in from different places all over the country, and they meet with a teacher who has a lot of expertise in math and a lot of expertise with technology, and that's a really strong program. And so for your children who are blind and on level math-wise, or even advanced, this is a really nice opportunity for them. So those type of programs are really what now Schools for the Blind are doing to keep themselves relevant and to keep themselves modern, and that's a real pro. The con is you don't want to send your kid away to school. You want your kid to be able to go to their neighborhood school. So now Schools for the Blind are really working hard to make that happen, provide real social experiences outside of that just being in the blind school with everyone else. So you guys touched on the socialization piece, and you also really touched on the segregation piece, and you did a wonderful job with that discussion. The last one I want to talk about, which we really could talk about forever, so I'm not going to, is that everybody kind of agreed that technology has a huge impact on the education of students who are blind and visually impaired. So some folks kind of talked a little bit about think about the history of technology for the blind and visually impaired, and we're talking about very low tech. Perkins Braille, for example, which was probably very high tech at its time, is now you push buttons and you basically emboss dots and you make letters that are tactile that someone can touch and read, all the way up to the very latest, devices that we use today. And so some folks, especially some folks that have visual impairment in the course, which is really nice, shared with us kind of what they use, books on tape, Daisy, Duxbury, Bookshare, Braille, and a couple of you made the comment that Braille is still very important for learning, and I absolutely agree with that. And what I would want you to consider when we're talking about these kind of topics, and people, as a teacher of the visually impaired, you're going to get questions about that. Well, is Braille really necessary? My take on it, and we'll talk a little bit about this later on, is really that, you would always teach a sighted child to read and write. So that's what I kind of say. You always teach a sighted child to read and write. So you definitely would teach a blind child who, can learn it, who requires it, would always teach them Braille. There are exceptions, and you're going to learn these as you go along the way, and how you decide it is built on your assessment. But for the most part, Braille is still a really important tool for learning, and it is technology. It's just not as high-tech as kind of what we're used to today. But we definitely all agree that technology has made a huge impact in access, is the word, in access to materials, to the world for people who are blind and visually impaired. And there's all kinds of cool stuff that allows folks with blindness to navigate, to do all sorts of really, really cool things. And we'll share some of those as we go along in the semester. So great job. I really appreciate your wonderful discussions. There are a lot of you, so I might not respond to every single discussion every week, but just know that I always read them. I'm always keeping up with them, and I really enjoy reading them, and I really enjoy what you're contributing. So thank you so much for the discussions. Have a great week.